Hello and welcome to It's Called Football. In today's podcast, we're going to be rating each Premier League team's transfer window from 1 to 5. We're going to start off with Arsenal, who are currently top of the table. So in terms of players that they signed, they've brought in Leandro Trossard from Brighton for 27 million. Pretty good signing in my opinion. I think that the big thing coming into this window was improving the depth of the squad, because obviously that's what you need towards the latter half of the season, where you're coming up against teams like City who are chasing their tail, who have a lot more depth in them. So that was the main thing, and I think Trossard's definitely a player that can do that. Jakub Kiwior was the second one that they signed for 21 million. Once again, a defender that, to be honest, when I watched his interview and his welcome to Arsenal thing, he looks a little bit too shy. So I'm not sure that he's really got the confidence and the presence to be in that Arsenal defence. But I'm sure he's a talented player. He's still young, and he's mainly just there to challenge Gabriel for his space. Finally, they signed Jorginho, who a lot of mixed emotions about with Arsenal fans. Chelsea fans are very happy to have him gone, from who I've spoken to. That was a £12 million deal, and once again, it's just all squad depth. None of these players are going to be regular starters. It's just purely to have that little bit of safety towards the end of the season, where you've got high quality players that are second or third choice. So I think in terms of signings, they've been fairly successful. They've sent Sambi Lokonga off on loan to Crystal Palace. He obviously wasn't happy with the lack of game time he's been receiving. So I'm going to put Arsenal second in the second tier, I think, because they've done pretty well. There's nothing major that's going to impact their season and go that's the player that's going to carry them to the league. But I think they've done what they set out to do. They've increased the squad depth. They haven't lost anyone key. They've just extended Martinelli's contracts. They're secure in their future as well. Overall, I think it's pretty successful, but it's nothing too special. So I'm going to give it a 2. The next team are Aston Villa. They have brought in Alex Moreno for 12 million. He has been in Spain his whole career, starting off at Barcelona's youth. So this is a new challenge for him in the Premier League. They've also signed John Duran for 15 million. He's only 19 years old, but he's already made 77 club appearances and scored in 18 of those. So obviously, once again, a club that's trying to secure their future. I think it's okay. They've lost Danny Ings to West Ham, which I think is quite a big blow. I think he's a very reliable striker on his day. So I'm going to give it a 3, but it's a low 3 in my opinion, because they've lost a very well-proven player for people that they aren't sure that are going to be fantastic. John Duran, 19. Yes, he's shown that he's got a bit of talent, but can Aston Villa be the team that develop him? And then Alex Moreno, kicking on a bit. He's never been in the Premier League. He hasn't had that much success in Spain. So once again, it's another risk. So yeah, I think a 3 is about right for them. Moving on to Bournemouth, they are currently in the relegation zone at 18th. So they need to bring in a lot of new players to sort of fight to stay in the Premier League this season, and they have done just that. So they've signed Dango Altura for 24 million. He's a young forward, so he's done quite well in terms of getting himself up to the top level of his club. He impressed on his debut for Bournemouth. 24 million, quite a lot for a team like Bournemouth, so bit of a risk, but it seems as though it could pay off, and we'll see at the end of the season if they survive. This could be a key reason for it. They've also signed Ilya Zabani for 20 million. Once again, they're bringing in these players that they're hoping will be able to get them out of the relegation zone. They've also brought in Matthias Viña and Hamad Traore on loan from Roma and Sassuolo respectively, and also Darren Roundell on a free. They were linked with Zaniolo, but it didn't amount to anything in the end. So overall, I think that's pretty good. They know what they needed to do, and they have done it. They've brought in the players that they need to save them. So I'm going to give it, once again, I'm going to put it in number 2, but I think that's very dependent on if they survive. Moving on to Brentford, they're doing very well this season, in 8th at the minute. They haven't actually brought anybody in, which is a little bit disappointing, because you'd think that they'd be bringing a couple of big players in to ensure that they stay in the top half of the table. They've only brought in Romeo Beckham is the only big name that you'd probably recognise just because of David Beckham, but he's in the B team, and they have sent Sergi Canos off on loan to Olympiacos. Nothing major. They haven't brought anyone in permanently for the first team. So a little bit disappointing. I think I'm going to give it a 3 because they don't necessarily need to do anything because they've proven that they play good football. They can do it. But it would be more towards the lower end of 3 because I think they're one spot off of the Conference League. If you want to push for those sort of spaces, you probably do need to improve your squad a little bit in January. Moving on to my team then, Brighton, Moises Caicedo. Would we be able to hold on to him? In the end, we did, despite record bids put in for the Ecuadorian midfielder from Arsenal and Chelsea. To be honest, it's a bit of a risk. He's put out that statement about how he wanted to go. But if it's all awkward and he doesn't get back into the form he was in, it could prove to be quite a big moment that ruined our season. So it's a risk, but I think he's a talented player, he's a hard-working player, so I think it will pay off. We have brought in 2 young stars in Facundo Buonanotte and Yacine Ayari, both for 5 million each. Once again, young players that have probably got a lot of potential. Brighton's scouting has been unbelievable. We have sold Leandro Trossard, as I mentioned earlier, 27 million. He just wasn't getting on with the manager, so it was time for him to go. But obviously he is one of our best players as well, so we didn't really find a good replacement for him. Obviously, Buonanotte and Ayari are for the future. Shane Duffy has left to go to Fulham on a free transfer, and Aaron Connolly has gone on loan to Hull. Overall, pretty average window for Brighton. I think you would have liked to see some of the money from last summer been used towards a big player to replace Trossard. I'm going to actually put us as 4 because I just think you had all that money to replace Trossard. These players that we've brought in probably won't make an impact for another 2 or 3 years. Next is Chelsea. Now, this has been a big talking point because of the amount of money they've spent. They spent over 300 million this window, so we're going to have to wait and see if it pays off because that's quite big for a summer window, let alone a January window. ENZO FERNANDEZ for 107 million. He was brought in from Benfica after Chelsea activated his release clause. Obviously, young player of the tournament. He's really, really good. They've brought in Mykhailo Mudryk for almost 90 million. They've paid 20 million for João Felix to come on loan for like 5 months. Benoit Badiashile cost 35 million, and alongside him, lots of other youth players were signed for the future. They sold Jorginho, as we mentioned, to Arsenal. So I'm going to put it in 2 because I think it is very good, but I'll just have to see whether or not it pays off. Moving on to Crystal Palace then, who are currently in 12th at the time of recording. Yeah, they brought in Sambi Lokonga on loan from Arsenal, and they've also signed Ahamada for 11 million. He's a young French midfielder with a lot of potential, so obviously they're looking to bolster that midfield. They've struggled massively, I feel, after losing Conor Gallagher. They also lost Jack Butland on a loan move to Man United after Dubravka was called back by Newcastle. So I'm going to give it a 3 again. It's one of them where you just have to wait and see. Now, moving on to Everton, this is probably, in my opinion, the worst one of the window. They sold arguably one of their best players in Anthony Gordon to Newcastle for 40 million. That's all very well and good because obviously he wanted to leave, but then you've got to get a replacement. You're 19th in the table. Your manager's just been sacked. Sean Dyche was brought in 1 week before deadline day after Frank Lampard was sacked because of how poorly Everton are doing. I just think if you're getting that 40 million, you've got to look to go and spend it straight away on someone that's going to get you out of this mess, and they just haven't. It's just a mess at the minute, getting a new manager 1 week before deadline day, losing one of your best players, not finding a replacement, not using the money that you've been given. Just very disappointing. Moving on to Fulham, they are currently 7th, definitely overperforming. They have signed Saka Lukic for 8 million. Shane Duffy has come in on a free from Brighton, as we spoke about earlier, and Cedric Suarez has come in on loan from Arsenal. They're quite good signings to try and help them stay in that top half of the table. I highly doubt they'll qualify for Europe. Players gone, Anthony Knockaert, Josh Onama and Nathaniel Chabaloa have all gone off to teams in the championships. I think the big thing is that they've held on to Mitrovic, who's their top goal scorer this season with 11 goals. I think that is what puts them in second slot because they've held on to the players they needed to in order to keep them as high as they are, and they've brought in some players to strengthen the squad to ensure that they can stay in that top half of the table at the end of the season. Moving on to Leeds, Weston McKennie has come in on loan from Juventus. They have also signed Max Volbert for 11 million and Jorginho Rutter for 25 million. Some very good signings to help them. I think personally I'd actually put them in second. They've obviously lost Matthias Klick on a free to DC United, and Diego Llorente has gone out to Roma on loan. They've brought in some good players. I think it's more towards a high end of two. I'd be tempted to put it in one, but I think it's just their position at the minute. If they're a bit higher, then it would be a one. Moving on to Leicester then, they are currently 14th. They bought in Victor Christiansen for 12.5 million. He's a 6'6" centre-back, and I think that's really good they've brought him in. Obviously, they're looking for a bit of presence at the back. They've also signed Tete on loan from Shakhtar and also signed Harry Souttar for 15 million. They've loaned out Jose Perez and Marco Brighton to Real Betis and West Brom respectively. And they've held on to key players such as James Maddison and Tielemans. I think that's what probably puts them as a one, because they've held on to players that definitely should have gone. They're not doing well. So I think it's a very successful window in the sense they've held on to some of the best players they've got. Tielemans is an unbelievable talent. Obviously, Maddison is very, very underrated. They've brought in players to strengthen the squad. You know, 6'6" centre-back is saying something. They need clean sheets. They need to fight back up the table. I think the main reason I'd put them up there is because they've held on to their best players. So yeah, I'd put them at the top for me. Someone I'd probably put at the bottom would be Liverpool. They are currently in 9th. They've done absolutely nothing this window apart from sign Cody Gakpo for around 45 million. I think personally, bit of a rush. Yes, he did well at the World Cup, but Premier League's so different. I think the big thing is that they didn't get a midfielder in, which was so what they needed. They're currently in 9th, which for a team that have won the Champions League, won the Premier League in recent years, it's just not what you want. So I'm going to put them down with their Merseyside rivals. You could have used that 40-50 million to buy a good midfielder to help you try and get something. Another fairly disappointing window for a top club is Man City. They are currently second, obviously chasing Arsenal for the top spot. They only signed Maximo Perrone for 8.2 million. He's just a young Argentine player who definitely won't be getting used for a good few years. With some issues at the training ground between Pep Guardiola and João Cancelo, he has been loaned to Bayern. Probably one of the best fullbacks in the world. Definitely one of City's best players. It's a risk because obviously Pep's putting his trust in Rico Lewis. Nothing impressive to try and fight for that top spot. Next team is Manchester United. They've signed 3 players on loan in Wout Weghorst, Jack Butland and Sabitzer. Sabitzer has come on loan from Bayern as Eriksen is currently injured, so they just need that bit of depth in midfield just in case. I think this is probably another case of a middle range team. They've brought in some players to keep the depth to fight for that Champions League spot. Moving on to Newcastle, who are 3rd in the Premier League at the minute, doing really well. Anthony Gordon for 40 million. I don't know how he's worth that much. They've also signed Harrison Ashby for 3 million. They've lost John Joe Shelby and Chris Wood to Nottingham Forest. I think it's a little bit disappointing. I don't know why they spent that much on Anthony Gordon, but they're doing really well. I'm really impressed with them so far this season. In terms of transfers, just not very impressive at all, to be honest. Now, Nottingham Forest have surprised a lot of people in this window. They have brought in Gustavo Scarpa from Palmeiras alongside Danilo for 18 million. Scarpa's on a free. Chris Wood has obviously come in, and so has John Joe Shelby, both from Newcastle, as we just spoke about. They have signed Felipe for 2 million from Atletico Madrid. He's obviously got that experience. And then the big one would be Keylor Navas on loan from PSG. Now, he is a world-class goalkeeper. And so I'm going to actually give this, I think I'm going to give it a 1 again, because they've brought in a world-class player that's going to help them. They're 13th, which doesn't sound brilliant, but for a team that's just been promoted, I do think that's quite impressive. Moving on to Southampton, they really need to do something in this window. They're currently bottom of the table. They've signed Orsic for 6 million. They've signed Carlos Alcatraz for 12 million, Sulemana for 22 million, and Onacha for 20 million. As long as these players can help and do something for the club, they can do quite well. But once again, they're unknown names. Orsic is known purely off of FIFA. I feel that people are going to think he's going to do better than he actually will. This is a really, really disappointing season for Southampton. Moving on to Tottenham, personally, I think they've done really well this window. They've hijacked that Arnaut Danjuma deal from Everton, signing him on loan from Villarreal. He scored on his debut, which was quite impressive, and they finally managed to get the Pedro Porro deal over the line for 40 million after back and forth with Sporting over the entire window. Due to Porro signing, they had to get rid of a couple of right backs, and they've done just that. So they released Matt Doherty and let him go to Atletico Madrid on a free, and they've loaned out Jed Spence to Rennes. It's a fairly good window. I'd give it a 2. They should be chasing Champions League. Some of their top players aren't quite on form. Everything took a bit too long, especially with the Pedro Porro deal. Nothing too special, but it has improved the squad where it needed to be improved. West Ham then, currently 16th, just floating above that relegation zone. They brought in Danny Ings. He's a Premier League proven striker. It's not too bad of a deal. He did just get injured on his first game. They've also lost Craig Dawson, who's somewhat of a legend at West Ham. He was a big part of their Europa League push. I'm going to give it a 4. I would have given it a 3, a high 3, but Danny Ings got injured straight away, so it totally defeats the point of why he was brought in. Finally, we've got Wolves, who are sitting in 17th. They are even closer to that drop, just above it at the moment. I'm actually really impressed with their window. I think they've brought in a lot of players that needed to be brought in order to help them stay above the drop. And, if those players can do that, that would be considered a really big success. They brought in Matheus Cunha on loan from Atletico with an obligation to buy. They've brought in Pablo Sarabia for 4 million, Craig Dawson, as we just spoke about, for 3, Mario Lemina for 10, and João Gomez for 15. These are all players that can slot into the team quite nicely, as well as a little bit of depth. If they survive, then it's a really successful one. But I just think Matheus Cunha is a really good one. Youth player with a lot of potential. Craig Dawson, he's proven it. He's got the experience and the composure. They've done a bit of everything, and I do think they'll survive, which is why I think I'm going to put them in 1, because I do think they've done really well in enabling themselves to stay in the Premier League. So that is the end of the tier list. That is where I'm going to end the podcast. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back very soon with another one.